Hello, and this is going to be a fun round glass review. I mean, they all are, right? I think so. Anyway, I have fun. I think you're going to have fun with this one too, because this is a fun little lens. The Pentax 110 18mm PanFocus lens. This lens was made by Asahi Pentax. The name is the Pentax 110. Now it's technically called the 10 system, so this should be called the Pentax 10 system 18mm f2.8 PanFocus. Now what do I mean f2.8? Well, it's f2.8 out of the box. It reaches its pan focus capabilities when it's stopped down to f6.3. This lens was made starting in 1981 to likely 1985. I couldn't find an exact discontinue date, but in 1985 the 110 system was discontinued, so it's probably safe to assume they didn't keep making this lens after that. Typical lens uses are pretty much just as being a focus-free walk-around for the Pentax 110 cameras, and as a lens doing that, it works great. In fact, this is probably my favorite Pentax 110 lens on 110 film. But on digital, it kind of falls apart fast. So for those of you who have better things to do, here's the general point of this video. The PanFocus is a mixed bag that, in general, is a lackluster performer unless stopped down. To that end, if you grab the M43 adapter with the aperture that this lens can use, it gives this lens more versatility. Using an M43 to Sony E adapter allowed me to use this lens on digital with an aperture. Now that said, most of the images in this video were taken on 110 film. Also, this lens's PanFocus, as I mentioned, doesn't kick in until f6.3, so if you're using this on an apertureless adapter at f2.8, you're going to have a thin focus range that's only a handful of feet in front of you, and then some pretty icky out of focus areas. So realistically, this lens does not do much of anything at all that's good for you, unless you have a way to control the aperture. Now, giving you nothing that you can't find on pentaxforums.com. The focal length and AOV are 18mm and 61.5 degrees on 110 film. If you're going to use anything larger than that, like micro four thirds, APS-C, or God forbid, please don't do this, full frame, that angle of view is going to be larger until you reach the corners of the image circle. The aperture range starts at f2.8, and that's the only aperture that you're going to get unless you have this on a 110 camera or that micro four thirds apertured adapter. With the Pentax 110 cameras, the way that the shutter worked is that there was a leaf shutter and then a mirror behind them. The mirror was light tight to protect the film. When you went to take a photo, the leaf shutter would stop all the way down, the mirror would pop up, and then the leaf shutter would open just enough to reach the aperture that was needed for the lighting conditions. So that's how this lens got to smaller apertures, and by the way, all of the Pentax 110 lenses. With the micro four thirds adapter, that closes to a very, very tiny opening, and while I didn't get a measurement of what the smallest setting would be with this lens, it stops way down. So with that, you can get a lot of depth of field control. The element and group count on this lens are 6 and 6. The design type is retrofocus. The filter size is 30.5mm. The closest focus is 175 centimeters, which in the US is the height of an average height woman. The drive type is not applicable because there's no focus whatsoever on this lens. It's fixed at a specific focus point, and you can't change that. The native mount is the Pentax System 10. The dimensions are 34mm by 21mm, and it weighs in at a staggeringly, almost imperceptibly light 29 grams. The 18mm PanFocus was intended as a super simple snapshot lens that could be used for quick, easy framing with no concern over the exact focus point. It was intended, by the way, to give you basically hyperfocal distance almost every time you use it. So because this lens is set with the prime focus being round about 175 centimeters, it covers everything from infinity to that point or closer at f6.3 and smaller. The smaller the aperture, you're going to use, you're going to get slightly closer to the lens, but not by incredible amounts, because as you stop down an aperture in a lens, you get more distant focus, but less close focus. And then also with this lens, by the time you reach f8, you're pretty darn close to diffraction limiting the sharpness, and anything smaller than roundabout f8, you're really going to offset your depth of field focus gains with diffraction softness. So building on that, my best tip is going to be reserve this for Micro Four Thirds use. And for those of you who use Micro Four Thirds, feel free to splurge on that aperture adapter for this lens and any other, except for the 70mm System 10 lenses that you have, because it does make them significantly more useful on Micro Four Thirds. If you wanted to use this lens on Sony E or other shorter than Micro Four Thirds mounts, get the aperture adapter for Micro Four Thirds and then an M43 to your mount adapter. At f2.8, this lens, it has the same optical design and build as its focusable twin, and both of these lenses are completely unremarkable at wide open on digital. A second important tip on film with 110, this lens does perform very nicely, and I enjoy using it a lot on 110. With digital, it's just not sharp enough to keep pace with what sensors demand. This lens lacks a bit of contrast on digital files, and that lack of contrast translates into a lack of sharpness. But with 110 film, that's really pretty well masked by your enlargement ratios. For metering, well, that's going to depend on your format. The large dark areas in the frame will throw off full scene metering with APS-C and full frame. It's less of an issue with APS-C, but with full frame it does lead to slight overexposure in the image circle. So if you wanted to use this lens on full frame, I strongly recommend using center-weighted metering for better exposure in that image circle. My last tip is that if you want to use this lens for digital, skip it. There are other more digital-friendly 18mm focus-free options that are newer, have more advanced designs, and that don't suffer from cracking plastic barrels, which is an issue with some of the Pentax system lenses due to age and plastic shrinking and things like that. This lens is nice and small and tiny, but by the time you throw in some adapters and things like that, it's more expensive than a lens cap lens of the same focal length, and also way more fragile. This is a pretty typical and tiny retro-focus design. It's special in that the aperture rests behind the rear element, and that's part of the Pentax 110 camera design, and it exists there because the Pentax 110 cameras have the guillotine shutter that I explained earlier that closes prior to exposure and then opens to give you the proper aperture. This lens, as I also noted, has the same optical design as the focusable version, so if you are hellbent for leather on getting this lens, the focusable version is substantially cheaper and worth looking into instead. All of the typical lens use items in the script are NA for this lens when it comes to video. I do have some notes for you that I think should help, however. Firstly, on APS-C and Super 35 video, as well as M43 of course, the PanFocus covers the entire sensor. So this is usable on APS-C cameras for video without vignetting. The mounts on these lenses are generally pretty wobbly, just as an FYI, and that means that if you bump the camera while you're taking video with this lens, you're going to get a lot of image shake. If you don't have an aperture adapter, do not bother using this lens for video, as the focus point is close and the blurry area is unpleasant. This would be the ultimate one-trick video pony without an aperture, and it's not worth going after this lens for video unless you have that aperture adapter. Sharpness is fine, stopped down, but not great wide open. On 110 film, this lens resolves more than well enough for that format. On digital, it's soft with some noticeable field curvature. Build quality was fine for the time that it was built and the use that it was intended for, but some number of Pentax system lenses across the spectrum, not just one specific model, have suffered from cracked barrels due to shrinking housing plastic. I've seen this a couple of times on the focusable 18mm lenses. Contrast is generally a bit poor on digital, fine on film. Out of focus areas aren't awesome, so it's fortunate that stopping down slightly gets rid of them. Distortion is present, though not awful, in the area intended for image capture. Go outside that intended image area and the distortion gets noticeable. Flare control was fine, and almost none of the images I took with this lens exhibited flare. Ghosting control was much better than I expected. I had read that these lenses ghost, but I had limited issues with that. I had one digital ghosting example and it's noticeable, and two film examples where the general color performance made the ghosting less noticeable. Balance with cameras is fine on the 110 cameras and way too light for anything digital. The 18mm PanFocus lens makes photography as easy as it can be. Simply point and fire, and for those of us using the Pentax 110 cameras, this is the ideal point-and-shoot lens. 18mm on 110 and micro four thirds has a field of view that's roughly the same as 36mm lenses in full-frame terms. So for photographers looking for a tiny lens that can be ideal for street photography, well, this is a good option. And if you have an aperture-free adapter, you can always make a fixed waterhouse-style insert to use that will make this lens work at or around hyperfocal distance. Ultimately, though, unless you're shooting a Pentax 110 film camera, this lens makes no sense. The 18mm PanFocus and also the focusable 18mm in the 10 system produce results that are far less technically precise, fairly artistically uninteresting, and of lower overall image quality than do other similarly priced lenses today. On 110 film, this lens does still perform in a reasonable manner, and the flaws in its images are largely masked by the enlargement ratio and grain in 110. For a micro four thirds user who has the aperture adapter, this lens can be a fun experiment, but it will always struggle and likely never deliver images with the same color, contrast, and clarity as a body cap lens, which also will certainly be far more durable. The Pentax System 10 18mm PanFocus lens for 110 cameras is an oddity today, an uncommon relic from a time when small was the new big, tiny the new cool, and miniature cameras a fair trade-off for the size reduction they provided. This lens opens a door to a time when photography sought to mix simplicity with adaptability. The PanFocus was the simplest of lenses and the simplest to use of cameras, but could be easily carried alongside other swappable manual focus lenses. The marketplace need for a simple-to-use camera with adaptability and various lens options has not disappeared. This is why so many, if not all, new cell phones now come with multiple camera modules for different lens focal lengths. Cell phones have replaced cameras like the Pentax 110 and its various tiny lenses. That fascinating past that this lens hints at is one not too different from today, where casual photographers not fussed by technical precision wanted fast, easy gear that could record memories in a way that met many users' needs: small form, low weight, small prints. Today, a cell phone has a small form, low weight, and delivers images to screens. The PanFocus lens tells us that all of the technological changes over the past 40 years have simply been a new way to meet a long-standing need.